concepts in examining the ecology of populations. Life history traits are also very important in population dynamics. Natural selection will act on developmental, physiological, and behavioral traits to favor those that increase fitness. Thus, these factors would increase reproductive rates as well as survival rates. These traits can be described as life history traits. Organisms can vary with respect to three main traits: the onset of reproduction, the number of reproductive cycles that they have throughout their lifetime, and the number of offspring that are produced within each reproductive cycle. The onset of reproduction is defined as the age in which an organism must reach before it can reproduce. The onset of reproduction can vary greatly across species. Some organisms have late maturity, like the loggerhead turtle, that can only reproduce after it reaches about 30 years of age, while other organisms can reproduce relatively quickly, within a few years after birth or within a few days after emergence of an adult fly, as the phorid fly, as seen here. The number of reproductive cycles that an organism can have within its lifetime can also vary greatly across species. Some oviparous organisms are organisms that only reproduce once during their lifetime. This is present in the agave plant as well as coludas. The agave plant produces a flowering stalk for reproduction when conditions are optimal. This is very energetically costly for the plant, and as a result, many of these plants will die shortly after a flowering stalk is produced. Male coludas will die after mating. This means that they only have one mating season that occurs approximately 10 months after they are born. Iteroparous organisms, however, can reproduce repeatedly through their lifetime. Oak trees can produce thousands of acorns every single year, while snakes can have 1 to 2 reproductive cycles per year. Populations can also vary, or species can also vary, with respect to the number of offspring that they can produce during a reproductive cycle. This can also vary greatly among species. The number of offspring that can be produced for each reproductive cycle can also further be affected by the nutritional state of the parent, the level of parental care involved, and environmental conditions. Some animals, like the white rhino, can only have 1 or 2 offspring for each reproductive cycle, while other organisms, such as butterflies, can produce large numbers of offspring at each reproductive cycle. There is also an evolutionary trade-off that exists when considering the reproductive characteristics of the population. In general, there is a trade-off between the number of offspring that can be produced and the amount of energy a parent will give to each offspring. In general, caring for more offspring will typically lead to a reduction in survival for the parent. This could also be costly, as the potential survival of the offspring could also potentially suffer. As a result, there will be a balance between the number of offspring produced and the level of parental care that exists. There is also an evolutionary trade-off between the number of offspring produced and the overall size of those offspring. Some plants have evolved to produce many small seeds, while other plants produce fewer larger seeds. Dandelions, for instance, produce many small seeds that can be easily dispersed through the wind. The Brazil nut tree, on the other hand, produces very few seeds. However, each pod has a very large endosperm, and the presence of this endosperm will increase the seed's survival, whereas there is a very high level of mortality in the dandelion strategy. When considering populations, there is also a trade-off between R and K selection. When populations have logistic population growth, they can usually be classified as R-selected populations or K-selected populations. Populations that fall under R selection will have traits that maximize reproduction, whereas K selection populations will, in general, natural selection will favor those traits that maximize their survival at high densities. K selection is a common strategy when population sizes are near or at carrying capacity. The K selection also occurs in populations that invest more energy into their offspring or live in more stable environments. R selection is more common when population sizes are small, when populations produce many offspring, or if they live in unstable environments. This chart here depicts the differences between K and R selected populations. Note that, in general, R-selected populations have short lifespans and fast growth. They also have high reproductive investment, birth rates, as well as death rates. They typically have many reproductive cycles per year and produce many offspring at each reproductive cycle. Their offspring size in general will be small, they lack parental care, and they also live in very variable environments. K-selected populations typically have longer lifespans, slower growth, and low reproductive investment. They also have low birth rates and low death rates, having only a few reproductive cycles per year and producing few offspring at each reproductive cycle. In general, the size of each offspring will be much larger than R-selected populations. They typically also have parental care and live in more stable environments. As stated in the previous lectures, density can become a very important factor in determining population growth. Density can alter the rates of birth and death as well as the rates of immigration and emigration. If a population is termed to be density independent, this means that these population parameters described previously will remain constant over various density levels. However, if a population is density dependent, that means that these population parameters such as birth and death rate will change with the density of the population. Often at high density levels, birth rates will decrease and death rates will increase. This then serves to cause an overall decrease in population size. At lower density levels, typically birth rates will increase and death rates will decrease. In general, at low densities, this usually leads to an increase in population size. Rates within a population can also vary with respect to how density affects them. For instance, a population may have a density-dependent birth rate, however, their death rate may remain relatively constant and would act as if it is density independent. Let's first consider a population where the birth rate decreases as the density increases. However, the death rate is density independent. Let's also consider a population where the immigration and emigration rates are equal. Thus, these factors don't contribute to the population growth or decline. In this scenario, many populations will approach an equilibrium density, which is denoted by the value Q. Note that this is the point in which the density-dependent birth rate equals the density-independent death rate. As a result, there would be no population growth at an equilibrium density. Thus, the population size would be constant. Note that in this scenario, as stated before, the birth rate would equal the death rate. In general, population growth is halted at high densities. This can occur through negative feedback mechanisms that affect reproduction, growth, and survival. For instance, at high population densities, the kelp perch population experiences an increase in death rate as well as a lack of refugia from predators. As a result, this limits the growth of the population. There are also many other mechanisms that will regulate the growth of populations in a density-dependent manner. These include resource competition, where individuals within a population will compete for resources. Thus, at high densities, their reproductive rates will be reduced. There are also many intrinsic factors within a population that will act in a density-dependent manner. Density levels can affect the physiological state of an individual. In addition, aggression and hormonal changes may delay reproduction at high densities, thus limiting the growth of the population. The transmission of diseases can increase with increased density, the buildup of toxic waste products, and finally, individuals with a population may compete for space if they exhibit territoriality within their behavior. This means that at high densities, the space for each individual becomes limited, thus limiting their overall population size. The study of population dynamics examines the biotic and abiotic factors that can cause variations in the size of a population over time. Populations of different species can be interrelated in ecosystems. For instance, many large mammal populations are considered to be relatively stable over time. African elephants in captivity exhibit stable population growth. This is important as this aids in the conservation efforts for that species. In reality, many populations are not steady state, meaning that they will fluctuate over time. These population fluctuations can also have ripple effects on other populations or species within the ecosystem. An example of this concept is examining the wolf and moose populations on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. These populations became isolated after the last lake freeze in the 1950s. Before that, individuals could freely cross and walk over the lake to reach Isle Royale. Rates of immigration and emigration after the freeze became negligent. This is because the island was too far away from the mainland in order for individuals to emigrate or immigrate. Since the populations on Isle Royale became isolated, the moose populations began fluctuating. This is due to the high levels of predation. This occurred during 1980, where you can see a distinct drop in the population of moose. Also note that this also corresponds to a distinct increase in the wolf population. Moose populations also declined greatly after a harsh winter in 1995. After the moose population crashed in the 1980s, there was then a subsequent drop in wolf numbers. This eventually led to an increase in moose populations in the 1990s before the harsh winter crash of 95. Note that when you typically have an increase in moose populations, you then see an increase in wolf populations, as this is a major food source for them. When moose populations decline, you will also have a decline in the wolf population, and vice versa. Thus, these populations are linked together as a result of their ecological interactions. Some populations, like the lynx and the hare, cycle on a regular basis. This also is exhibited in voles and lemmings that typically have a 3 to 4 year cycle. This will also be reflective in the recycle of their main predators. In northern Canada and Alaska, the lynx relies primarily on the snowshoe hare as a major food source. The hare in general has a 10-year cycling pattern. This is primarily driven and explained by the overexploitation that occurs by predators, causing a decline in the population. Lynx populations, on the other hand, cycle due to the availability of hares as a food source. This demonstrates the interconnectedness of populations. Some populations can inhabit discrete patches within a larger landscape. These are termed metapopulations. The patches that exist can vary in size, number of individuals present, location, quality of resources, and level of isolation. If one population in a patch becomes extinct, individuals from surrounding patches can recolonize those areas. As a result, the rates of immigration and emigration become integral in determining the overall population size within a patch as well as over the entire landscape. The Glanville fritillary butterfly, for instance, has local populations that are distributed in a patch-like manner throughout the Åland Islands in Finland. Overall, this species can persist on those islands, as the individual populations may fluctuate and may even go extinct. Our final topic in this lecture is examining human population dynamics. Since the 1650s, the human population has been growing exponentially. However, since 1960, this growth rate has slowed a bit, dropping from 2.2 to 1.1% in 2018. This exponential population growth is primarily due to the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, there were greatly improved agricultural practices. This allowed for urbanization, increased food production, better sanitation practices, and also major advances in science as well as medicine. This led to a dramatic increase in birth rates as well as longevity and a decrease in death rates. When examining the growth rate of the human population, zero population growth typically happens in one of two ways. There can be no population growth if there is a high birth rate and high death rate, or if there is a low birth rate and low death rate. As technology and living conditions improve, populations may undergo what is termed a demographic transition. This means that the population will transition from having a high birth and death rate to having low birth and death rates. These rates can also vary regionally and can also vary within countries as well. An example of this is when China implemented the one-child policy. This shifted the population to undergo a distinct demographic transition to low birth and death rates. Delayed reproduction, due to higher levels of education and higher career goals, is also another mechanism which shifts a population from having high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. Age structure is also another important aspect to examine when considering human population dynamics. Age structure refers to the number of individuals that are present within different age groups within a population. These can be depicted in age structure diagrams. These diagrams can provide valuable insight into socioeconomic issues and are very helpful in predicting population growth trends. Note the overall age structure of the population in rapidly growing areas such as Zambia versus no growth areas such as Italy. The United States lays somewhere in between, exhibiting slow growth of the population. Another important aspect to consider when examining human populations are infant mortality and life expectancy at birth. Infant mortality is defined as the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births, and life expectancy at birth is the predicted average length of an individual after birth. Underdeveloped regions such as Angola may have higher rates of infant mortality as well as shorter life expectancies. Regions such as Japan, on the other hand, have lower rates of infant mortality and very long life expectancies. These factors can play a very important role in determining the overall dynamics of the populations in those regions. When considering the growth of the human population, it is also important to consider the concept of having a global carrying capacity. In assessing the global carrying capacity, it's important to recognize that an ecological footprint exists for each individual city or nation. An ecological footprint refers to the amount of land or water that is required by that person, city, or nation to produce the resources needed and also to absorb all the waste that are generated. It's typically represented in global hectare units or GHAs. It is estimated that a sustainable value sits at a value of approximately 1.7 GHA. Our impact on the planet can be estimated by assessing various factors such as resource use as well as rates of waste production. The diagram to the left represents the per capita ecological footprint that is present for various regions on Earth. The current global average, considering all of these regions, sits at about 2.7 GHA, which is higher than the sustainable value. The average value for a person living in the US is 8 GHA, which means that each individual within the US, on average, lives a very unsustainable lifestyle. Many models have been generated that attempt to predict what our human global carrying capacity is. However, that value is currently unknown. There are many factors that will come into play to determine this overall value. These include food availability, freshwater supplies, as well as the levels of our waste production. The upper limit to the human population is also highly dependent upon our ecological footprint. If we all lived more ecologically sustainable lifestyles, the overall carrying capacity would increase. In addition, the distribution of wealth and resources, various socioeconomic issues that are present, and our access to healthcare, medicine, and technology will also play a role in determining this value. As a population, we as humans control how we achieve zero population growth. We can decide whether we choose to lead more sustainable ecological lifestyles and we achieve zero population growth through social change, or if we achieve that growth through other more drastic processes that lead to high mortality. These would include resource limitation, disease, as well as environmental degradation.